A lot of speaker companies will get up and say, well, we make stuff that's completely different than the other guys. We're one company for whom that is absolutely true. There's no other company like us on the planet that makes speakers the way we do. And so I'm not here to sell you loudspeakers. I'm simply here to make a presentation that shows that there's a couple of ways to do things, and we've chosen a way that's different from literally everybody else. Fair enough? Okay, so an alternative, choosing loudspeakers. Does the choice of a sound system really matter? Does the choice of a loudspeaker really matter? If you have a venue, if you have a concert hall, if you have a sports arena, does the speaker you choose matter? I submit that it probably does. But before we go there, let's review what we think a sound system should do. And those of you who were here yesterday, we went through this a few times, and so for you it'll be familiar. Well, a sound system should provide adequate level for the task. And I think we understand that. If you're trying to do a heavy metal rock band and you show up with 2 loudspeakers on a stick, that's probably not going to work, especially if you expect crowds of 5,000 people. Right? It's not adequate. And yesterday we did talk about, and I'm not going to repeat that, but just to say that we talked about the responsibility that sound people have with regard to sound pressure level being excessive. And, you know, I'm a huge advocate for protecting ears. And I urge you to take that responsibility seriously if you're operating a sound system. That you have the ability to hurt people. And take that responsibility seriously and don't do it. A sound system should provide an equal level for the task. It should provide even coverage. Right? I mean, yesterday we talked about this in the context of church, but it doesn't really, it's not limited to churches. If you're doing a concert, why shouldn't everybody hear the music well? So I think we can all agree that even coverage is an important aspect of a sound system, yes? The third one, direct sound to where there are ears, that's, to me, an obvious one. It's stupid to send sound to where there's no ears. It's a waste of energy, and indoors, it can be have a negative effect on the way the sound behaves. It can affect intelligibility and a bunch of other stuff. Next, fidelity. The system should, hopefully, if you want it to be, it should be true to the incoming signal. Fidelity simply means honesty or faithfulness, from the Latin word fidelis, which means faithful, right? Now, we were talking just a few minutes ago. Not all sound systems have to be accurate. Most of the sound systems you've heard in your life aren't. In fact, I try to break down sound systems into 2 big categories. There's sound production systems and sound reproduction systems. A sound production system, for example, would be the bass rig that I plug my bass into. Accuracy has no meaning there. I don't necessarily want my bass rig to accurately reproduce what's coming out of the instrument I play. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. What's more important is that you, the audience, hear what I want you to hear. You hear the result of my fingers on those strings through that instrument, through that cable, through that amp, through that loudspeaker in that room, and hopefully I can make that sound exactly the way I want to. And I don't even care if that rig is accurate. I've never measured my bass rig. I don't want to know. I just want to know when I plug in, it sounds the way I want to. There may be other situations where you absolutely want something to be accurate, right? And finally, efficiency. Now, you might argue that efficiency doesn't matter because power is cheap. And if you're talking about small sound systems, you'd be right. if you're doing a 300-seat small auditorium or a 500-seat church, and you have a system that takes a couple thousand watts or a system that takes 5,000 watts, what's the big deal? Doesn't matter. At Danley, we do a lot of work in very, very large stadiums. We've done stadiums that have as many as 105,000 people in a stadium. And if our competition is going into those very large stadiums and saying, okay, we can do it with 1.5 million watts, and we come in and say, well, we'll do it for half that, 750,000 watts, that's a big deal. That's a lot of amplifiers. It's a lot of power being drawn from the power company, and it's a lot of heat that has to be dissipated by the air conditioning systems. So at some level, efficiency does matter. Okay? So I'm going to propose this. Do you know what the word rubric means? Is that a word that you're familiar with? Okay. Well, I'm going to sort of propose this as a rubric, or as a sort of a test, right? So what we're going to do now, excuse me, is we're going to sort of step back through time. No, I haven't invented a time machine. At least not that I know of yet. But we're going to step back and look at sort of the history of sound systems, and we're going to apply this rubric to these old systems and see, did they measure up? As a way of sort of understanding where we were and where we're going. Okay? All right, so put on your seatbelts. We're going to zoom back in time, back to the 1960s, of course. That's my generation, where we thought we could change the world, and maybe we did a little bit, I don't know. World seems like still a pretty messed up place, so I'm not sure how successful we were. But we did bring rock and roll. That's something that my generation can be proud of, I think. And if you sort of think back, here's good old John Entwistle from The Who, and back when he started out, there weren't sound systems. They would plug their guitars in or they didn't mic the instruments, they just mic'd the vocals, because that was the weakest link. So they had to get the vocals up over the guitars and drums. Yeah. And so, you think back, I look out here and there's probably not many of you that, can remember this. A few of us with gray hair remember this. But here's a little band of some consequence that came to my country back in the 60s. You might recognize these four guys. This is the Beatles at Shea Stadium. Shea Stadium is no longer there, but it was a big baseball field in our country. And you can see here I think there were 47 some odd thousand people there. And here's the band. And does anybody see the big line array stacks anywhere? No, not quite. There were 4 loudspeakers on the stage, and they piped it through the little paging horns, the little tin paging horns that were all through the auditorium. And people who were there said you couldn't hear the music at all. I mean, all you heard was the screaming of the fans that were hearing the Beatles, or thought they were hearing the Beatles for the first time. So I think this was a pivotal moment. This was where the promoters realized, what, this isn't going to work. We need to figure out some way so that these fans can actually hear the music. The technology didn't exist, but this is where people started thinking about, how can we do this? Because this is not going to work. And so if we apply our rubric to this primitive sound system from the 60s, clearly it fails on all levels. Was it adequate for the task? Hardly. Did it provide even coverage? I'm not even sure they could understand what that meant. I'm sure there were parts of that stadium where you couldn't even hear the paging horns. Direct sound to where there were ears? How about fidelity? What does that even mean in this system? And of course, efficiency. So I think it's fair to say that back in the 60s, at the birth of rock and roll and the birth of early PA systems, none of them came close to meeting our rubric. Would you agree? Yeah. So let's zoom ahead to the great 1970s. And I'm not, obviously there's a lot of sound systems, a lot of history we could talk about. I'm just sort of picking out the iconic sound systems from each of these decades. And of course, where do you think I'm going to go in the 1970s? Anybody guess? What is the most iconic sound system of the 70s? There you go. There it is. The Wall of Sound, the Grateful Dead. Yeah. That's one I wish I had heard. But I didn't. Now, this sound system is fascinating on a lot of levels. We could do an entire lecture on that sound system because for its day, it was a remarkable feat of engineering. And I'm sure many of you have seen this photograph before. It's a famous photograph of the band rehearsing, and they're setting up the PA. You're hoisting up the lights, and of course, this thing actually was going to be hoisted up a little bit higher. But one thing that I remember looking at this as a young man starting out in this business and realizing there was something about this that didn't make any sense. What do you see in this picture that doesn't make sense? Where are the performers relative to the sound system?
In front of it.
They're standing right smack in front of the wall of sound. Now, how did they do that? How did they do the vocals? Do any of you know? You know. You're not allowed to answer. You're running the camera. How did they do the vocals? Yeah. When I used to be a college teacher, one of my goals was to pose questions that were so intriguing that people would lose sleep over them. So I'm really tempted not to answer that and let it bounce around in your heads. You're not allowed to look it up. Put that phone away. All right, I'll tell you. This was, I think, the very first time differential microphones were used in a PA system. They actually bought Brulin Care, which was the company that sold their performance mics to DPA. So this is these are very, very expensive measurement grade microphones. They had pairs of them for every vocalist, and the microphones were wired out of polarity with each other. So that you had these two capsules, and for sound that was far away, the sound would arrive, the microphones would capture it, flip the polarity, and completely cancel it out. But for sounds that are close, you're always going to be closer to one diaphragm than the other. The phase flipping wouldn't cancel, and that's how they did it. So they would pick up their voices, it would go through the PA, but the PA wouldn't come back into mics and cause feedback. So we look at this and we say, well, how stupid could they be? And yet, this is a sound system that was remarkably advanced for its day. And I'll suggest to you that probably, in my way of thinking, this sound system was more of a sound production system than a sound reproduction system. I'm not sure the Grateful Dead really cared that you heard their instruments and their voices exactly the way they wanted to. I think they were fine with letting the PA change that and make them larger than life. And yet, if we apply our rubric to it, it probably did, if you read first-hand accounts of people that heard this system, it got loud, and it probably was loud enough to cover the kinds of stadiums where they used it. So, yeah, I think they probably figured it out, and, maybe for the first time in history, we have a sound system that was indeed loud enough for the task. It's hard to look at this, though, with the knowledge that we have now about how loudspeakers work and believe that it provided even coverage. I suspect that there were hot spots, and I suspect that there were dead spots. And I suspect that everyone was so altered that nobody cared. Rumor has it that there were a lot of drugs going around in those days. I wouldn't know. Directing the sound to where their ears. I'm not sure. Probably not, because there's nothing in that stack of loudspeakers that suggests to me any kind of control about where it goes. Right? Fidelity, that's also a tricky one. And efficiency, I don't think so. So, in this case, you know, number one probably meets the rubric for number one, but maybe not the rest. Let's move on more quickly here. But I had to spend time on this one. This is certainly iconic. Here's another iconic system in our country. This is one of the few sound systems that actually had a name. Of course, the previous one also had a name. Everyone knows that as a wall of sound. This one is known as Big Bertha. And Big Bertha just was retired about 5-6 years ago. This is at the University of Kentucky, Rupp Arena. It's a basketball court. And this sucker is or was huge. Somebody actually bought this, a private collector, and is building a building to house it. So it will live on as a museum piece. It was comprised of 60 horns, and it stood about 20 feet tall, and it was installed in 1976. So here's a system back from the 70s that was also iconic. But if we think about our rubric once again, it was barely loud enough for the task. It didn't cover very well. And if it didn't cover very well, it probably didn't direct the sound to where the ears were. Fidelity was a little iffy. And of course, it probably was quite efficient, since everything there is a horn. And horns are efficient. So it probably, the first one and the last one, probably made it, but the rest not. Let's zoom up to the next decade. Now, in the 1980s, we saw the development of the first constant directivity horns. These were designed by Don Keel. Don Keel actually worked for Electro-Voice and JBL and a number of other companies. He probably owns more patents on horns than any other living human being. And these white horns here were his design. This is a system that I designed for the Chicago Jazz Festival, and it's all horns. Even back in those days, I like to use horns. So these are high-frequency horns, mid-range horns in here, and bass horns down at the bottom. And, you know, it worked. It got loud enough for the Chicago Jazz Fest. Coverage, sort of. It's actually interesting because the coverage depended on the coverage. These two you could almost take together. There's sort of different ways of saying the same thing. This had this interesting property that the seats are way down here, and there's a very slight rise out towards the back. This was probably 40 feet in meters. That would be, I don't know, 8-9 meters tall. And the problem is that this was right on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, where there's pretty significant wind coming off the lake and very large temperature changes. And so at some times during the day, the high frequencies would encounter a thermal gradient, and they would bounce off and wind up in the high-rise towers across Lakeshore Drive, and we'd have police complaints that it's too loud, and none of it was getting to the ground. And then in the evening it would all switch, and of course the people were screaming it's too loud on the ground. So, you know, even coverage, it depends on the temperature and what was going on. Fidelity, I'll admit wasn't that great, but it was pretty efficient. Again, all horns. And of course, in the 80s, we had people like TurboSound building these modular boxes, and we had, sound systems like this where you stacked up a bunch of these modular boxes, and boy, what a mess that must have been. And you look at that and say, adequate level, maybe. Even coverage, I can't believe that it was. Probably failed on all scores. Because we're still trying to figure out how to do this, right? So let's zoom ahead into the 90s. Now, folks, here's where something quite remarkable happens. And I want to be very clear about this. We're at Danley, we're known as the guys who hate line arrays. And I guess that's true. I've been guilty of, saying that. But this is something you have to respect. Christian Heil, in 1992, patented, effectively, the first line array. And his company, Acoustics, remains until today. And this was a remarkable achievement. Christian Heil is not an idiot. He's a very bright guy. And this was an improvement over everything else that came before. This was the time when something remarkable happened in our industry. This was what we call a sea change. And I'm telling you, a lot of people have made a lot of money with this technology. And I'll be the first to admit, this is a lot better than this. Much easier to load in, much easier to load out. It had much better integration. Probably sounded better. Right? The guy deserves recognition. But let's look at it critically for a moment. Can these things provide equal, adequate level for the task? Most likely. Sometimes you have to use a lot of boxes to get there. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Even coverage and direct sound to where their ears, to some extent. And it certainly was better than what came before. Fidelity, well, because it uses a principle called interference to create directional lobes, you have to really question the fidelity part. They can be made to sound good, but generally not over the entire audience. But where they really fail to shine, in my opinion, is efficiency. It takes an awful lot of power to properly deploy a line array. And we're going to come back and talk about that some more.